Hi there, this is Helen Tarrant again from leases. Here with our whole team. Wow, it's massive. Welcome to another episode of Commercial Property Roadshow. You're here with Helen Tarrant, and today I'm going to cover with you bad leases and how that can affect the value of your commercial property. Now, a lot of people aren't aware of this when they construct a lease, and we find this happens when vendors and landlords go off and try to construct their own lease, or they get desperate, right? And then they just take the next tenant as it comes along, and what happens is they end up with a lease that they get stuck in, and that they end up paying for it in the next 5 years or even 10 years for that matter. Now, this happened to me. This is a personal experience that's happened to me, and I've now just seen it in another property that's happened, and it's really dramatically reduced the value of that property. But I was in my younger years when I just started out in commercial property, and one of my leases came up for renewal, and I just got sort of trapped by the tenant because they ran some large pubs. They ran so they ran a chain of these bottle shops and pubs and things like that, which was just really hard for me to sort of negotiate. Like they just played really hardball at the time, and I couldn't get through anything when I was trying to negotiate with the manager. My property manager couldn't get through, and then finally they said the owner wanted to sit down. So I sat down with the owner. I flew up on one of my trips to the Gold Coast. I actually met the owner and chatted through with him. He was going to do a lot of renovations on the property, somewhere around 160,000 or so. And I couldn't come up with sort of going halves with him or anything else. So I gave him rent incentives, but it was a pretty steep rent incentive. I gave him a 2-year rent-free period. And then they capped the increase on the property in terms of the rent when he went to market review. So it was a 5-year lease, 2 years rent-free, 3 years of the lease, and then they capped the increase. So when we go to market, the rent can only go up by 10%, and then it goes through another it gets some yearly increases, etc. But the main thing is that it wasn't an equitable lease. It wasn't a fair lease. And today, if I wanted to sell that property, it would become very hard for me to sell that property. In fact, I'll probably now need to hold that property for another 5 years until we have the rental increase, and then look to sell it, right? And then the market might have changed, right? So with something like that, with a lease like that, where you are trapped for 3 or 5 years, you can't sell in the market when the time comes. So we just had the rising market, and even though we've had interest rate rises, it hasn't really affected where we're going with commercial property. That the yields are there, the yields hasn't gone up, it hasn't, like, the prices hasn't fallen, it hasn't changed. So in fact, more people are coming into commercial property. But the thing is, I can't go and sell that property that I have because I think it's a great time to sell, because the lease sucks on it, right? And recently I've seen another property, and I've done an inspection. So here's the video on the property, so you get to see it. And now that you've seen the property, you know what it looks like. It's on Main Street of Chatswood. It's, well, not Main Street, but it's further down from the shops, but it's still a really good set of shops. And the history of this property is that it did become vacant for the first time in probably 20 years during COVID. And at the same time, 2 other shops became vacant. And you can see that now that COVID's over, all the shops are full, right? All the shops are full. But during that time, at that particular time, it became vacant. And the vendor really needed to make his mortgage repayment, so he needed to put a tenant in. And obviously, you're up with competition. You're a set of strip of 7 or 8 shops. 3 becomes vacant. It doesn't look very good, right? And, you know, plus we've had the lockdown and everything else. So it was just a time incidental issue. So he put a tenant in, and the tenant drove really, really hard. And it probably wasn't a fair bargain, but at the same time, what happened was that the tenant got a 5-by-5 year lease. And next door to the tenant, you can see it's a carpets and blinds people. Next door, it's carpet court, and you know that carpet court provides carpet, right? But carpet court is paying somewhere around $80,000 to $85,000 on the rent, and we're talking gross rent because we're comparing apples with apples. This tenant has struck a deal with the vendor at $55,000 gross, right? Which, if someone's paying 80 and you get 55, that's like a 30% drop in rent, which is ridiculous. Fine in the year of COVID and perhaps the year after, but definitely some provisions about rent going up and rent provisions and market reviews, all of those things, right? But no. So the property was struck with 5 years starting. This started in 2021 and it's going to go to 2031. So 10 years. That's a long time in the property game, especially in somewhere where we're in Metro Sydney. Chatswood, one of the biggest areas that has the biggest capital growth, and he can't sell it because the rent isn't going up, right? So $55,000 gross for someone who's paying land tax and everything else. If you're not paying land tax, it's a different matter. But if you were paying land tax on this property, the property actually gives you about $25,000 net after all outgoings goes out. That's after management fees, land tax, and your rates and insurance and everything else, which $25K doesn't even cover your mortgage, right? So it's very, very low. And yes, you could have done for the first 2 years, but definitely rent review at year 5 when the tenant takes up the option. But the lease doesn't allow for it. And so then the vendor, unfortunately, due to family situations, have to sell the property. And he puts it on the market for $2.5 million, and no one wants to buy it. And the reason for that is that the lease is so low that even though next door sold for 2.2 mil earlier on this year, he was not able to get anywhere close to that because of it, right? And because of that, it's devalue the value of his property because of that lease to the value of somewhere around 1.8 million. So he could have got maybe not 2.5, but maybe 2.3, 2.4. But now the true value of his property, or someone's willing to pay for it, is probably somewhere around 1.8 million. Now, 1.8 million, and the person who's buying it is still going to be negative, right? And so it's not a good deal for the incoming purchaser anyway, right? So he's actually taken, by having a bad lease, he's taken off 500 grand of the value of the property. So with that in mind, you can see how a bad lease can significantly impact your property, right? For my property was located in Rockhampton. I think that, today, if I was to sell it, I probably could have sold it for $650. I bought it a few years, but like 3-4 years back, and it was my first time into Rocky, and it was a different time, and I could have negotiated better, and I didn't. And today, I would not be able to sell it for $650. I would not be able to sell it for much more than what I bought it for, which was around the $450 mark. So I may be able to sell it for $500, which means that we've just had the boom in regional in Rocky, and I'm going to miss that because I have a crappy lease. I basically constructed a crappy lease. Yes, they did do a refurbishment. They spent way over $160,000. I went and visited the property. They probably spent $200 grand. They've redone the facade, new cool rooms, bathroom blocks, everything. The tenant's not going anywhere. The tenant's very, very solid. I still get a good return. I get about $30,000 or so, and your rent will increase this year. I'll get $30,000 or so. So after my against $30,000 against $450 that I paid for is still a good return. But if I wanted to sell it for $650, I'm not able to, right? If the tenant had market reviews, if the tenant has, if the lease was better, that they paid a little bit more outgoings. In this lease, they're only paying for the council rates and the water. They're not paying for insurances. So if I had management fees and no land tax applicable, so if I was a little bit more savvy at the time, and for me it was a different time, and it was the first time into that particular area, so like a lot of people do get burnt when they go into a different area, and this is why you would engage someone who's a professional. But for my personal experience, now I wouldn't be able to sell that property for $650. Now that's not a huge deal, because I can hold that property till whenever until the lease expires. And then at which point it's probably going to be another 3 or 4 years for expires, at which point I can renegotiate and then sell the property. But it's not I probably could have capitalized on 150. But in a portfolio, when you have 10 or 20 million, that's really insignificant. But where you have a property like that in Chatswood, and you are taking $500,000 off the value of the property, then you are actually, it's a significant dent to your portfolio. Because what happens is it's not a win situation for the incoming purchaser, because they have to now hold the property till 2031. They can't kick out the tenant, right? And believe me, the property manager has tried everything to kick out the tenant, but the tenant's on a solid lease. Like, unless you buy the tenant out for 10 years, which is not worth it for you to spend that chunk of money, because it's going to equivalent to the value of the property. But they've offered to buy the tenant out for the first term. They've offered to give the tenant incentives, but the tenant's like on a good deal. Why should they leave? And they said they're absolutely not going to leave, and we can't sue the tenant or evict them. They're on a solid lease. That's signed, execute it, right? In that case, he is lumbered with that property for the next 10 years until 2031, where the tenant comes off the lease, and then you can renegotiate a new rent or put a new tenant in there, and the rent will double, right? Over time, he's got a 3% rental increase over time, which, he's missed out on the CPI this time. At least he could have said CPI. But of course, during COVID, we know the CPI went backwards, and most people hated putting a tenant on CPI. But of course, 2 years down the track, CPI goes to 6% or 5%, and you wish you put a tenant on CPI. But no, it swings and roundabouts, right? So you've got 3% rental increases. So the tenant will have rental increases over those 10 years, but it's not going to keep up with the way that the rent and the value of this property will be, because at 2031, the tenant will still be paid 30% less than what everyone else is paying. So you have to really wait for them to come off that lease, renegotiate the rent. The rent would jump, probably 30-40%, and then the value of your property then is realized. But for most property investors, they don't want to wait. They don't want to wait that time. They don't want to wait 10 years to get their gain, especially when, with this property being on a $55,000 gross lease, adding even 3% each year, next 10 years is going to be not just negative, it's going to be significantly negative, right? On a $2 million purchase, or 1.8, and you're borrowing, let's say, 1.4, then, or even, let's say, even 1.2 or even 1, depending on how much you're borrowing. If the interest rate goes to 4, you're looking at somewhere around $40,000 just per million. So really, somewhere with this property, somewhere around $60,000 to $70,000 a year to hold, and you are effectively, they're giving you $25,000 to $30,000. So you're negative by $40,000 to $50,000 on one property. Great negative gearing, but really sucks as a commercial property investor. And that's what I want to illustrate, how the difference of having a good lease or a bad lease is. A bad lease can take the top of your commercial property value. You can really just wipe out your capital gains like they did with this property. And I thought it was a really good case study to bring to you so you can see the difference. And there's no way to combat it once you've signed that lease, right? You're kind of stuck with it, right? Just like the tenant stuck with it. Yeah. So either way. So I guess when you do negotiate the leases, if you feel you're overwhelmed, and I've been in that position, do reach out to someone professional like us, and we can help you go through that for a consulting fee, and we can, work through it. We help a lot of our clients in not only, this is why, we are more wealth creators than just commercial property buyers agents, right? So what we would help you do is negotiate the lease, look how equitable it is, find out what we have done similar leases like with similar tenants, because you might feel like you're the only tenant who own a dentist, a property with a dentist, right? Or a medical center or a childcare center, or perhaps a strip of shops like this, where you've got, a blinds tenant coming in or a restaurant coming in. That might be your only property, but for us, we see it all the time. So we know what the benchmark is and what the standard is, and we can help you work you through this. So you get an equitable deal that's win-win at the end, right? It's about having a win-win so that when you can realize the value of your property or the value of your asset, you can actually truly realize it, right? So connect with me, helentarrant.com, or reach out to me at helen@commercialpropertycashflow.com.au, part of the Unicorn Commercial Property Group. We're here to build a long-term commercial property portfolio with you, for you, so that you can get passive income through a commercial property. So in the meantime, subscribe, hit the bell, and let me know if this video has been informative for you or not. Thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.